Welcome. I'm Rick Hasen of the UCLA Law and the Safeguarding Democracy Project. Very pleased to welcome you today to Voting Machines, Risk Limiting Audits, and Faith in U.S. Election Results. This panel is co-sponsored by UCLA Law's Institute for Technology, Law, and Policy. I want to thank Harley Ham and Ben Austin DeCampo for their important logistical help today. And I want to tell you that the Q&A box will be available to you for questions. You can put those questions in there, and I'll try to get to some at the end of the panel. Before we turn to today's panel, I want to tell you about some upcoming events, all webinars of the Safeguarding Democracy Project. On Tuesday, March 31st at 12:15 p.m. Pacific, we will have the rescheduled webinar, Myths and Facts About Contesting the 2026 Midterm Elections. That will be with Ned Foley of Ohio State, Rebecca Green of William & Mary, and Derek Muller of Notre Dame. On Thursday, April 9th at 12:15 p.m. Pacific Time, we'll have Can and Will Courts ensure free and fair elections in 2026? That will feature Lori Ringhand of the University of Georgia, Miriam Seifter of the University of Wisconsin Law School, and Steve Vladeck of Georgetown. And then finally, the last webinar of our season will be on Thursday, April 23rd at 12:15 p.m. Pacific. This is the State of American Democracy in 2026, a kind of big picture final event. That will be with Michael Kang of Northwestern, Lisa Mannheim of the University of Washington, and Fernita Tolson of USC. Today, I'm very pleased that we are turning to the topic of voting machines and risk limiting audits. One of the things that's important for the Safeguarding Democracy Project is that we encourage dialogue, not just across the political spectrum, but between disciplines. And I think since many people in the audience are lawyers and law students and election administrators, we may not have the technical background necessary to understand some of the key questions about how our election results are tabulated and how they are checked for accuracy. I'm pleased that we have two excellent panelists today. I'll briefly introduce you to them. Their full bios will be put in the chat box on the Zoom if you're watching this live. Andrew Appel is the Eugene Higgins Professor Emeritus and Senior Scholar in the Department of Computer Science at Princeton University and a visiting professor at Cornell University. He served from 2009 to 2015 as chair of Princeton's Computer Science Department. He researches software verification, computer security, programming language, and compilers and technology policy, especially voting machines and election systems. Jennifer Morrell is the Chief Executive Officer and the co-founder of the Elections Group, where she develops professional resources for election officials and consults on election administration and auditing. She's a nationally recognized expert in election audits, specifically risk-limiting audits. She's successfully overseen RLA pilot programs in more than a dozen states and jurisdictions and authored a series on election audits titled Knowing It's Right. Their full bios, as I said, are quite impressive and in the chat box, but I'd like to get right to it. I've asked Andrew to lead us off in talking about what we know and don't know about the integrity of election systems and computer processes for both casting a ballot and tabulating. And then we'll turn to Jennifer, who will talk about risk limiting audits and faith in elections. And then I'll have some follow-up questions and we'll turn to your questions. So welcome to you both. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Just got to get my screen share organized. All right. I'm going to talk about how to have trustworthy elections using hackable computers. If we look at how elections worked over 100 years ago, here's a polling place. There are a lot of people there. There's the voters. There are the people handling the poll book. There are voting booths to mark a paper ballot with some privacy. There's a ballot box. There's people watching that ballot box to make sure that nobody's stuffing ballots in there in an unauthorized way. And so the question is, What happens when, this achieves a trustworthy result, even though back in 1890, the parties didn't trust each other too much. And at many times in between 1890 and now, the parties haven't trusted each other too much. And it's transparent. The public, the voters, even the poll workers understand how these affordances are giving a trustworthy result. And what happens when you put a computerized voting machine in there? Well, computers can be reprogrammed. The great thing about computers is you can stick new software in them and they will do something else. The problem with voting machines is that whoever programs the computer decides what election results are going to be reported, either the ones that the voters indicated on the touch screen or the ones that some hacker decides should be reported. So the way to commit election fraud using a voting machine is you write a computer program that on non-election days, when it's being tested for logic and accuracy, it accurately counts the votes. And on election day in the polling place, it cheats in some way. And the voters won't see anything amiss because the indications on the screen will be just what the voters expect, but the votes could be counted in some completely fraudulent way. And then you have to load your program onto the voting machines by exploiting a security vulnerability. And modern computer systems, including all modern voting machines, have many layers of software underneath the application, in this case, the vote counting application. And sometimes there are bugs in those layers of software that lead to security vulnerabilities and ways, therefore, to install unauthorized software. And voting machines aren't usually directly connected to the internet. You transfer data in and out of them using a removable media, but they're indirectly connected to the internet via that media. And, if you can hack into your county's election system, sometimes that is a way to hack into the voting machine itself indirectly. Not to mention that the people that made the voting machine, that installed the software in there in the first place, could, if they were dishonest, influence the vote counting. So there's no particular evidence that any company has done that. There are a lot of conspiracy theories about the 2020 election. And when I look at the particular claims about mechanisms, they don't make sense. They attribute to one voting company, the equipment of another voting company. It just doesn't add up. So that's, a question that I have not seen any real evidence that the 2020 election was hacked. But the real question is, why should we have to trust the executives and insiders at the voting machine companies, or why should we have to trust the perfect, unachievable security of voting machines in order to trust our elections? Voting machines are hackable. What's the solution? Well, the solution really is hand-marked paper ballots. The US has typically too many different contests on the ballot to make it practical to count those ballots by hand, except in a recount where you have plenty of time to do it and only a couple of the contests to recount. So they should be counted by optical scan voting machines, either in the precinct or the optical scan voting machine could be at County Central. But those optical scan voting machines are also computers, and they could also be hacked to add up the votes a different way. But when you feed a paper ballot into an optical scan voting machine, it drops into a sealed ballot box. And provided that your local election administrators are managing the chain of custody well, you can recount those paper ballots by hand, or you can do an audit by human inspection of selected paper ballots to confirm the results or in fact correct them if the voting machine counted things wrong. And this is how we vote now in the United States. The counties marked in green are using hand-marked paper ballots. In almost all of those counties, they're counted by optical scan voting machines. The counties marked in yellow are using paper ballots produced by touchscreens. The voter goes into the polling place and indicates selections on a ballot marking device that is a computer touchscreen that prints out a paper ballot. And then they feed that into an optical scan voting machine that counts it. And the counties marked in red are using touchscreens without a paper trail, which is a very bad idea indeed. So, summary of part one. Any computer can be hacked. Whoever installs the software gets to decide how or whether the votes are really counted. Hand-marked paper ballots can be recounted independent of any possible computer hacking. Don't confuse hand-marked ballots with hand-counted ballots. Hand-counted ballots can work in small counties without too many contests on the ballot, but they're really difficult to scale up. And the good news is most states use hand-marked paper ballots, and you can look up your state or county at verifiedvoting.org, which has a great database of what kind of equipment is used in each place. Now, voting machines, including optical scan voting machines, can malfunction even if they're not maliciously hacked. Here's a picture from Windham, New Hampshire, 2020, where the voting machines were not hacked, but they malfunctioned and they miscounted votes. And there was a big to-do about that. And it turned out that, well, the crease in the paper was being misread as a fill in the bubble. So in order to determine whether you need a recount, it's a good idea to do a random sample audit. And the typical state audit law says, well, pick 1% of the precincts or 3% of the precincts and recount. That's not actually a very effective method. And there are more modern, effective methods of random audits. They're called risk-limiting audits. There's a whole variety of risk-limiting audits. It's an examination by humans of a randomly chosen sample of the paper ballot to check that the outcome claimed by the voting equipment matches the outcome that would be obtained by a full recount by human inspection of the human readable portions of the paper ballots. Jennifer is going to talk a lot more about risk-limiting audits, so I won't go into more details than that. I'll just say that for an audit law to be effective, it has to have some guaranteed probability of catching an incorrect outcome. That's called the risk limit. It should be binding. If the audit detects an incorrect outcome, then let's not inaugurate the incorrect candidate into office. It should cover all ballots and contests. Let's not make the mistake of thinking that only the offices at the top of the ticket matter in our democracy. And the most important thing about an audit law is don't take the computer's word for things. Don't let the computer tell you how many ballots there are supposed to be without being able to check the ground truth in physical reality. Okay, so I want to take a detour into the ballot marking devices that I mentioned. Those were the counties marked in yellow, where the voter doesn't mark a paper ballot with a pen, they use a touchscreen. BMDs, ballot marking devices, were originally invented to accommodate disabled voters who could not mark a paper ballot with a pen. But now, in a few places, all voters are asked to use the touchscreens. And depending on which make and model of touchscreen you have, it will produce a paper ballot that might look like this. On the right, you see the names below in plain text of the candidates you voted for on this ballot. And above, you see barcodes encoding those candidates. These ballot marking device computers are just computers. They could be hacked as well. If the ballot marking device cheats and prints different votes on the paper than the voter indicated on the touchscreen, what's supposed to happen? Well, the voter's supposed to read that carefully, but they don't. And if the voter detects that it's not what she intended on the touchscreen, then she's supposed to alert the poll worker, and the poll worker is supposed to let her have another chance at the ballot marking device. And scientific studies of real voters, and by now there have been 5 different studies in 5 different states. The vast majority of voters don't carefully examine their BMD printout or examine it at all, really. And so, if the ballot marking device is out to steal 5% of the votes for candidate Smith by transferring the votes for Jones into Smith, well, if 93% of the voters won't notice and 7% will notice, then the BMD manages to steal only, 4.5% of the votes, which is quite significant in a close election. And the real problem is there's no recourse. If a few voters in a polling place go to the poll worker and say, this is not what I indicated on the touchscreen, what's printed on my paper ballot, that voter has caught the machine cheating red-handed. But the voter can't prove that. What was on the touchscreen 3 minutes ago is no longer there. The voter might be mistaken. The voter might be lying. The Secretary of State cannot cancel an election result and order a do-over just because a few voters in each polling place make the claim that what's on the paper ballot is not what they indicated on the touchscreen. So ballot marking devices are not adequately auditable. If they are hacked, then election results can be changed with no recourse and almost no notice. And the style of ballot marking device that encodes the vote by a barcode instead of a human readable indication is even worse, because now the plain text might not even be what's counted. So, summary of part 2, ballot marking devices, that is touchscreen ballot printers, are inherently unauditable. They are appropriate only for voters with disabilities who cannot mark a paper ballot by hand. But even with hand-marked paper ballots, the optical scan voting machines can be hacked. So the solution is risk-limiting audits. And unfortunately, very few states have really comprehensive risk-limiting audits at the moment. Rick has asked me to talk about how is the security of voting machines today versus 10 years ago or more. So touchscreen voting machines, computerized voting machines really came into widespread use after the hanging chads fiasco in Florida in the 2000 election. And also around that time, the Congress passed the Help America Vote Act and formed the Election Assistance Commission to establish standards for voting machines. These are called voluntary voting systems guidelines. They're voluntary in the sense that each state is not compelled to require those standards, but in practice, almost all of them do. The Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines 1.0 that came out in 2005 barely addressed security at all. And in fact, all the voting machines certified to those standards between 2006 and 2022 tended to be quite insecure, very easy to install fraudulent software into. Those are all the voting machines in use in 2026. Then there was an effort 10 years ago to develop a 2.0 version of the VVSG, the Voluntary Voting Systems Guidelines, that address security and many other issues in a much more direct way. And finally, those got adopted in 2021. And in 2025, the first, there's 3 major companies making voting machines in the United States and 2 or 3 smaller ones. And of all of those, only one company has yet presented a voting machine to the Election Assistance Commission and to the states that's compliant with the 2.0 standards. And in fact, I was hired by the state of Texas last year to examine this voting system. It's made by Hart InterCivic. It's called Verity Vanguard 1.0. I wrote a 35-page report, but the top line is Hart Verity Vanguard 1.0 is a well-designed voting system. And I think it really has made a difference. The 2.0 version of the voting system standards that, this is impressively good compared to the voting machines made to the earlier standards. But still, in my report, I point out that with insider access, these voting machines can still be hacked. They can be hacked without insider access, so that's a little more difficult, but not beyond the capability of a good hacker. So we still need a paper trail. We cannot put all our trust in the software and the computer. And that's hand-marked optical scan paper ballots counted by optical scan voting machines, which ideally in the future, as the machines certified to the 2.0 standards come into use, will be less insecure than many of the ones we're using now. We will still need risk-limiting audits to determine whether a recount is needed, and recounts by hand don't trust that the computer isn't hacked. And with that, I conclude.
Thank you. You covered a lot of information. I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but first let's get Jennifer's presentation on the table, where she's going to focus on those risk-limiting audits and public confidence in election results. Over to you.
Great, amazing, Rick. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. Before I jump in, I want to just make sure folks that maybe are hearing about the elections group for the first time might not be familiar with our work, understand a little bit more about what we do. Our team brings expertise in election administration, communications, training, and to election professionals across the country. We do that through webinars, through networking, through online learning. We do that through in-person presentations and training. We do that through free downloadable templates and resources. And we do that through all-around support for the elections community. And I'm just extraordinarily lucky to work with an amazing team who gets to work with election officials across the country. So I want to start first by pulling out just a tiny bit before we jump into RLAs and talk about or define a tabulation audit. These are conducted after an election to ensure that the voting equipment was programmed accurately and tallied ballots correctly. And typically the process looks like this. We're comparing markings on a ballot to the interpretations made by the voting equipment. Regardless of the method, we have a random sample of voted ballots. Those are selected by audit boards or audit teams. They're going to examine the voter markings on each selected ballot and hand tally one or more of the audited contests. They might determine things like voter intent. So that's looking at marks outside of the target area or write-in votes. And then they're going to compare that hand tally to the results from the voting system. And that's done typically either by ballot or by batch. As Andrew mentioned, the most common tabulation audit methods are these three, starting with fixed percentage audits. So we have a predetermined percentage. Typically, that's 1 to 5% of ballots that are randomly selected and hand tallied for comparison to the machine count. We have risk limiting audits, and I'm going to talk a lot more about these. Similar to a fixed percentage audit, except that initial sample size will vary based on the margin of victory for the audited contest and the total number of ballots cast. And one interesting thing about RLAs is the audit is designed to increase in scale and even escalate to a full hand count, depending on whether discrepancies are discovered. And then we have something called automated audits, where ballots might be rescanned using a different voting system or tabulator than the primary system then the primary system or the official system, and the two results are compared. So kind of thinking about these three methods, we've got, as Andrew indicated, most states, about 36 states that do fixed percentage audits. We have 7 states that require RLAs. And I will say, like, of those 36 states, there are about a half a dozen that allow for RLAs. So counties can choose to do a fixed percentage or an RLA. We have another half dozen states that have pilot programs to conduct RLAs. There are a handful of other states, 7 that also do some procedural audits. And when it comes to these automated audits, we have states like Maryland, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Vermont that have done different things with the use of technology. They're in combination with RLAs or on their own. Okay, Andrew gave you a really great definition of what a risk limiting audit is. Just to reiterate, it's a post-election tabulation audit that examines a random sample of voted ballots to provide a statistical level of confidence that the outcome of the election is correct. There are a number of white papers and scholarly articles written on the subject. My experience with RLAs is certainly not as an academic expert, but as a practitioner. And I'll just note, when you're thinking about academic research or theory, one of the challenges can be translating that into practical application. I did write a couple of guides, Rick mentioned that in my bio, trying to help practitioners, help election officials with RLA implementation. And so I'm going to pull out just some of those definitions that I think will be helpful. Andrew mentioned there were several methods of RLA. So when we say RLA, we don't just mean one thing, but there are different ways of doing that. One of the first and probably one of the earliest ways that we saw, earliest methods used for risk limiting audits is what we call a ballot polling audit. It is exactly what it sounds like. The audit team randomly samples ballots. They'll examine those voter markings. They're going to tally those up. And they're looking for the margin of victory between the winning and losing candidate in that initial sample to be similar or greater to the official margin of victory that was reported. One of the challenges with ballot polling is communicating to the public how this works and how they can feel confident in something that's not a clear black and white. Yeah, it is a match. It's not a match, right? We're talking about this. We're talking about polling. Next is batch comparison. This is probably the one I see most in use. Again, similar to its name, election offices would take or randomly select specific batches of ballots. The audit teams examine those. Again, they're going to record voter markings on a tally sheet. And once all the ballots in the batch have been examined, voter markings recorded and totaled, they're going to compare the totals from the audited batch to subtotals from the voting system, and they're looking for discrepancies between the two. Next, we have ballot comparison. And in this method of RLA, specific ballots are identified and retrieved. Again, the audit team is going to examine the ballot. They're going to enter the voter markings for the audited contests. This method of RLA often requires the use of RLA software. Generally, it's the other two can be done sort of manually, but it is going to compare the voter markings entered by the audit team to the cast vote record created by the voting system. So we're looking at this really detailed, like one-for-one match, and the audit is looking for any discrepancies between those two. So there's been a lot of talk in the news lately about CVRs or cast vote records. As I mentioned, for this particular method, having that information is critical to doing this method of RLA, but also more importantly, you need to have a way to tie the ballot that's being audited to that cast vote record. And in some jurisdictions, the way that voting is conducted, that becomes very difficult. There are also a handful of pilots and some jurisdictions that have experimented with a hybrid method, so combining ballot polling and ballot comparison together. So I'm going to just look a little bit closer at some definitions, mostly that I see show up in RLA laws and policies that I think are really helpful to know. The first is the target contest. So whether you're auditing the entire ballot or a couple of races, often we see states will select a statewide race and then maybe a local race. But the target contest is going to drive the sample size. So usually one or two contests are selected as the target contest. Ideally, you want one that appears on every ballot in your universe of ballots. And often we might choose, if somebody gets to make the decision versus randomly selecting a contest, they might choose a contest that has a close margin. Regardless of what you choose, that margin of victory will determine how many ballots you need to inspect during the audit. So the risk limit takes the form of a percentage, something like 5%. As the slide says, a risk limit is the maximum possible chance that your audit will fail to detect and correct an incorrect election outcome. Lots that can be said about the risk limit. I'll try to just sum this up quickly, though. So with a 5% risk limit, you could say you have a 95% probability that your audit will correct an incorrect outcome if the outcome is wrong. As you might expect, a lower risk limit requires you to inspect a larger number of ballots. So an RLA with a 5% risk limit is going to require more ballots to be inspected or audited and more time than, say, a RLA with a 10% risk limit. But the smaller the risk limit, the larger the chance is that you'll detect an incorrect outcome. One thing I'll just flag is that often we see members of the public that show up for RLAs to observe those or looking at reports often misinterpret risk limit as a margin of error, which it is not. Sample size. This is the number of ballots that we're going to retrieve and inspect as part of the RLA. Again, as I mentioned, the sample size is going to correlate to the closeness of the race in that target contest. And then, and that is like one key difference, I will note, to a fixed percentage audit, right? In a fixed percentage audit, we're always auditing whatever the law requires, 1%, 3%, 5%. With an RLA, that sample size will vary depending on the margin of victory between the winning and losing candidate. Some other things that go into factoring in that sample size is that risk limit that I just mentioned. Also, the method of RLA, that batch comparison, ballot polling, has an impact on the sample size. And let's talk about that for a minute, because I'm not a statistician, I'm not a mathematician. There are many different math types that have been identified by academics. There is super simple. There's one called Bravo, Minerva, Sweet, Macro. One thing that I'll just say is it is challenging when you're trying to either communicate how RLAs work to the public, and especially when you're trying to put RLA laws and policies, you're trying to codify those. So thinking about like, are there ways that we could make this simpler? Often what I will see is in state statute, they will just link to the academic paper, or they will literally include in the rule or the statute a formula like this, which I'm 100% convinced no legislator truly understands. So I mentioned the methods. I mentioned that each of those methods can change the sample size. I will just say it's not as easy as a jurisdiction or a state just choosing one of those that they think is going to be most appealing. Often there are things that drive which method works for them. If you want to do ballot comparison, that one-for-one comparison where you're looking at a single ballot and comparing that to the cast vote record, often that works best if the jurisdiction centrally scans ballots. If you want to do batch comparison, where you're looking at a whole batch, you're comparing that, you need a voting system that can produce batch subtotals reports. So there are some things based on how ballots are scanned, based on the voting systems that are in place, that will impact which method of RLAs a jurisdiction or state can do. I mentioned that RLAs can be made easier with software. I think it's important to note that, especially as we're having this debate about moving away from technology, doing everything by hand. When we think about performing the math calculations, determining the starting sample size, even the random selection process, there are programs and software that can help make that easier and more transparent. The one thing I think that people most associate RLAs with is the dice. I will say it is about the only part of the audit that gets people truly excited and wanting to participate. Risk limiting audits do rely on random sampling to ensure that all ballots have an equal chance of being selected for audit. And this needs to be done in a way that eliminates the possibility of someone gaming the system by knowing in advance which ballots will be selected for the audit. So we do that by generating a random seed. Often we'll roll 20 10-sided dice, and we'll use that random seed in conjunction with a pseudo-random number generator. Again, there are lots of methods for doing this. This just happens to be the most popular, probably because it's the most fun. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up. I want to just point out that about 2.5 years ago, we started exploring not just risk limiting audits, not just tabulation audits, but really thinking about how we could help election officials and stakeholders create effective, strong audit policies and practices. We ran a series of workshops with election officials. I don't have time today to go into that, but we did produce a report that really focused on both core principles that could be useful. That was done looking at other work that had been done, looking at the generally accepted government accounting standards, and then getting great feedback from the practitioners, these local election officials from across the country. As part of that, we took those principles and we thought a little bit more about standards specifically for different types of audits, including tabulation audits. So again, regardless of the methods used, I mentioned that whether it's a fixed percentage, an RLA, these automated audits, these 4 steps generally happen. We think it would be great to see some of these standards that we identified be applicable in all states. I'm going to run through these really fast because it's really the last one that I want to focus on with the last few minutes I have. But there are things like, do tabulation audits take place before election results are certified? Do auditors physically examine all audited ballots? Are auditors independent? This is a tough one, but there needs to be a clear separation between those auditing the ballots and those who processed or tabulated them. Does ballot accounting or reconciliation take place before the audit? I was excited to see Andrew mention this as well. This is so critical. Maintaining this end-to-end accountability as part of the audit ensures that we can account for all the ballots. We haven't lost any, we haven't gained any. It's a critical part that we see missing from most state laws. Does the audit include at least one statewide and one local contest? Are audit units selected at random in a public setting? So that's that rolling of dice or some other lot drawing that takes place publicly. Are all ballot types and all voting precincts eligible for the audit? Andrew did a good job talking about the importance of that. Does the audit ensure voter privacy? Can we make sure that when we're doing these one-to-one comparisons, we aren't doing anything that would inadvertently identify a voter? And then this is the last one, and kind of just wrapping up my thoughts here. It's so important that a plain language post-audit report be made available. And yet we see so few jurisdictions and states doing this well. We know that we have a whole variety of things from states that don't report anything, those that maybe just publish data from the RLA software that can be difficult for most people to interpret. Sometimes local jurisdictions will aggregate that data send that data up to the state and will be aggregated. So we're seeing a whole variety of things, but very rarely do we see just plain language timely reports be made available. We tried to help with this by building a series of templates where election offices could either focus on the audit process or focus on the results, the numbers. We did some interesting work working with a handful of academic researchers to try to understand the impact that these types of reports might have on voter confidence and voter trust. No surprise, it's important. We did see a significant increase in confidence in the election. And one of the things, I'll just get right to the data. One of the things we learned, though, is that those reports are most impactful when they're coming from the local jurisdiction. So you can see here the audit process handout. We had a couple of treatments, including one that focused on the process, one that focused on results. You can see the process handout had the biggest impact. But you'll see that there wasn't a lot of spillover effect outside of the local jurisdiction that was represented in that audit report. So what does that mean? It means we need local jurisdictions putting together good plain language reports for their voters. We have a policy toolkit for policymakers. These are templates, so you can replace any of the key facts and quotes. You can make them your own. You can put in your own logo. But we would really love to see more people over the next 2 years really advocating for these types of reports so that voters understand what just happened. Did we do an audit? Who was involved? What did we find? Were there discrepancies? How were those handled? There are other audit processes, election processes that we think would be useful in auditing. And finally, there are new tools, there are new methods. I continue to see those pop out. People are piloting, trying different things. I'll just say that any new audits or tools we develop to improve the quality or efficiency of election audits needs to address these questions. Why was the audit conducted? What errors are we looking for? What standards are we measuring against? What evidence was produced to provide accountability to voters? And what was it that the audit was trying to achieve? And with that, I will stop sharing.
Thank you. I mean, you both packed in so much, and especially for someone who's not into the technical side of things. I learned a lot from both of you. I have questions for both of you, but I want to start with a softball question, which I wouldn't even think I would have to ask, but I feel like I do. We recently saw the Department of Justice send FBI agents to take ballots from Fulton County, actual ballots, as well as, I guess, other electronic materials related to the 2020 election. I want to know, what would it do? I'll start with Andrew and then to Jennifer. What would it do to the integrity of an election if before that this is an election that's been over for a long time, if we're still in the process of tabulating or retabulating, or there's still time for a recount or a court case? What does that do in terms of the security of election results? Andrew.
Well, I think we've understood for well over 100 years that between the time the ballots are marked by the voters and put in the ballot box and the time they're counted or recounted, that the chain of custody must be accountable for. You would hear stories from decades ago about ballot boxes being thrown in the river or lost or replaced. So to have, someone come in from out of state, whether it's the FBI or anywhere else, and take away all of the accountable evidence for the ballots of the election sort of destroys that chain of custody and makes the recounts, if there are any, untrustworthy.
Jennifer, I want to ask you, what do we know about how the chain of custody is protected in local election jurisdictions?
Yeah, well, the thing that I think most people don't realize is it starts long before the election. It starts the minute that voting equipment arrives in their facility when they're purchasing new equipment. If there are any updates to that software, it happens then. So anytime anybody is loading elections onto that equipment, they're doing maintenance on that equipment, they're moving that equipment, there's a log that's completed. There are usually seals to ensure tamper evidence seals. So if somebody has opened a lock, opened a door, opened a port that shouldn't be opened, that should be evident to anybody going in and inspecting that. As we get closer to the election, though, even beyond the equipment, those ballots are, whether they're blank ballots going out to polling locations, voted ballots coming back to election facilities, mail ballots that are being processed. Every time those change hands, those generally have some sort of form or log that gets completed. I think the really important thing here is election officials have a legal mandate to be the custodian of those ballots and the custodian of that equipment. And that's so critical, not just after certification, but if there are recounts, if there is a challenge, right? They have a legal mandate to preserve the integrity of that equipment and not allow someone to come take it, manipulate it, remove the ballots, et cetera. So.
And I want to stay on you, Jennifer, for a minute. One of the things that we see is conspiracy theories that are based upon apparently technical explanations of how ballots were miscounted or the machines were tampered with. This is a communications question. What is your advice for election administrators in terms of transparency, in terms of debunking kind of conspiracy theories that are not based on any reality about anything that might have happened?
Yeah, we encourage election offices to bring people in to do tours, to walk them through how the equipment and ballots are securely stored, show them those chain of custody forms and logs, explain to them two-person rules that are often in place, show them the cameras that are in place, explain how people might physically access a ballot storage room or a ballot storage cage. So that seems to have the biggest impact on trust. Secondly, whether it's information on their website, town hall meetings, it is helpful to break down some of these complicated things and try to show people either through visuals, through video, through diagrams, what's kind of like the life cycle of that ballot. Where is it going? What's being done? There are a lot of good examples across the country of election offices doing this well. Certainly a place we can continue to improve.
Thanks for that. Andrew, I want to come back to your presentation and the three major kinds of voting machines that you talked about. The hand-marked paper ballots, like with the optical scan, filling in like a Scantron, the ballot marking devices that produce a piece of paper that gets scanned and can be recounted by hand potentially, and the touchless, the touchscreen machines that are wholly electronic. I think there's probably widespread agreement that the hand-marked paper ballots are uh, the most auditable, very easy because everything was marked by hand, and you can check and see that physical evidence, and the touchscreen machines that produce only an electronic record are the most dangerous because there's no way to run any kind of reliable check on them, even though they're still being used in a few places. I want to hone in on the ballot marking devices because I think there have been lawsuits. There's been a lot of concern about this. And you were talking about the reason I think you were saying that you had concerns. There were two. One is if the barcode or the QR code is what's counted, that creates a problem because we can't read those. Those are not human readable. But the other is you're saying that a lot of people wouldn't notice if a race was changed. And I'm thinking if that is true in the real world, but given how social media works today, would it really be true if there were a place where, it's a battleground state and people thought they were voting for Trump and the ballot prints out Harris or vice versa, that people wouldn't notice? I mean, I think it would actually be something that would be
Well,
the font of a
okay,
lot of conspiracy theories and potentially something actually going on.
right. So um, the studies indicate, and these are studies of real human voters, some in controlled places that are not polling places, and some in real polling places. The voters just don't look at those cards. The few that do can notice, and if they do notice, they might write about it on social media. Other people might write about it on social media even if it didn't happen. So an election administrator or a secretary of state cannot use reports on social media as a basis for trying to figure out whether the BMDs are cheating today. So it's, as I described, a situation where the voter can catch the machine but not be able to prove it, or the voter can claim they caught the machine and nobody can disprove it. It's a real problem.
So there have been tests at actual elections to see what people know that their ballots were changed.
Here's two kinds of experiments or two kinds of studies. One kind is you observe real voters in a real polling place, but you can't see how they voted. You stand at the side of the room and you just measure how many seconds the average voter spends reviewing their ballot between taking it out of the ballot marking device and putting it into the optical scanner. And a typical measurement will show 50% of the voters don't even glance at the card before putting it into the optical scanner. And then the other half look at the card for an average of 4 seconds. Now, there are 18 contests on that particular example ballot. So that's a quarter of a second per contest to review the ballot. So that's real voters in a real polling place in a real election. And that study was done in Tennessee, but it was replicated later in Georgia. The other kind of study is you use real voters with a real voting machine, but not in a real election. You set up a study in the public library the week after the election, and you ask people, we're testing out a new voting machine. Try it out. You put the same contests that were on the real election the week before, and now you make the voting machine deliberately cheat in one of the contests on their ballot, and you see if they comment on it or bring it to the attention of the fake poll worker. And because it's not a real election, you're not actually committing a felony. So all of these experiments consistently demonstrate that the vast majority of voters don't take the trouble or are not very good at detecting when the voting machine has mismarked their ballot. And again, even if some voters do correctly detect that the voting machine is cheated, there's no recourse. You can't do anything about it in the real election, except that those few voters have a chance to remark their ballot and make sure it gets it right.
Jennifer, before you weigh in on this, I want to talk about trade-offs. So like one of the benefits, I live in Los Angeles County where they use proprietary ballot marking devices, and they have to prepare ballots in 14 languages. They have a lot of voters who are disabled, and they're producing paper that is much less likely to have a mismarked ballot than someone who maybe misses the ballot when they're voting by hand. How do you assess these trade-offs?
Yeah, I think we have to be careful that we don't set the bar so high that it's on another planet, right? In many jurisdictions, ballot marking devices can be the best method for providing voting for voters, simply because if you're in, for example, you're in a jurisdiction where vote centers are common, and you may have, as I did when I was working in Colorado, some like 600 unique ballot styles. Printing and stocking enough of those in adequate quantities can be really difficult. Having ballot marking devices much more economical, much easier to ensure that anybody that comes into that polling location can get the ballot that they're entitled to vote. I think the important thing here when we're talking about this, and I don't want to discount the risk that Andrew is mentioning. One, we're seeing a couple of things where ballot marking devices are used. Many jurisdictions now will set a sign or set an area, sort of reminding voters, let's take a look at your ballot before you deposit it. So trying to prompt them that way through visual signage. There are ballot marking devices now coming onto the market that can print, rather than the summary ballot, full face ballot that looks like one you would mark by hand. But maybe more important than that is the security of our election is a multi-layered process. Even the audits that I'm talking about, we sort of like to talk about it as a security sandwich. There are lots of layers. Audits are the last one, but all of these physical security requirements that are in place, even things like insider threat training, sealing ports where somebody might have access to, let's say, a USB port, or some way to connect the voting system to the internet, the logic and accuracy testing that takes place. All of these different things are critical. So there's no one silver bullet that's going to prevent the sort of thing that Andrew's talking about. But combined with all of these measures, both physical, cyber, operational, in some ways is the best that we can do in ensuring the integrity of our systems.
We're almost out of time, but I want to take just a few minutes to talk about internet voting or voting by phone. And the reason I want to raise this is because, if I'm at a cocktail party and someone asks me what I do, and they say, well, we use ATM machines, it's no problem. We're doing everything from home. We're doing, online banking, and it's secure. Why not vote over the internet? Andrew, let me start with you. And also, there have been these recent reports about voting by phone being tested out. What do we know about these kind of systems?
Well, voting by phone is voting by internet. I mean, what kind of phone do you use that isn't really an internet device? Voting by internet has real insecurities that cannot be corrected by a risk limiting audit, because there are no paper ballots that the voter got to hold in their hand and make sure it was marked correctly, and that later the recounters can recount. The security vulnerabilities in internet voting are both in the county computer server that collects the ballots from the internet In the cloud computing server that the service provider is using to transmit the ballots between the voter's device and the county computer. And just as important, the voter's own phone or computer. If those are infected by malware, then you as a voter can run the user interface and select your candidates, and the feedback will be, yes, here's who you voted for. And then it will transmit an entirely different ballot package than what you voted for. So Jennifer is absolutely right that we need this layered protection. We should improve the cybersecurity of our voting devices, absolutely. But we also need to be able to recount the same paper ballots that the voters had in their hands, and without having to take the computer's word for that this is the same votes we saw before. And that last part is totally impossible in an internet voting situation. I can bank on the internet because for each transaction, there's an auditable record per transaction. And if something, if there's fraud involved, it's the bank's job to, take care of that for me and recompense me. But we have the secret ballot in elections. It's very important that the voter cannot be bribed or coerced to vote a certain way, that the voter, that people cannot learn how you vote. So we don't have the same kind of individual auditability end-to-end of the transaction of voting that we have for banking.
Jennifer, I'll give you the last word.
I agree almost 100% with Andrew. On this one, we're in the same camp. I will just say, though, again, we have to be really careful about creating absolutes. We do have eligible voters, overseas members of the military, disabled voters, that in some situations, returning an electronic ballot might be the only way they have for receiving or returning a ballot. So I think we need to be thinking about ways that we can accommodate those voters. I think one of the biggest promises for me when I started talking about audits was the opportunity to improve our process, right? The opportunity to identify areas where there were discrepancies, where there were vulnerabilities, and look for ways to improve that. I think one of the things that's been, a lot of things have been difficult over the last 5 years, but we're in this place where identifying vulnerabilities or saying we want to try something new can be weaponized, it can be used against folks. And so we're really in this climate where it's hard. It's hard to say, yep, we did an audit, we found some issues, how can we make that better? And in this case, yes, there's some technology, it may make voting more accessible. Are there ways that we can try to limit or reduce the vulnerabilities or the risks? This is probably just not the right time, but I think eventually we've got to figure out how to do that.
Well, Andrew Appel, Jennifer Morrell, thank you both for taking the time. I'm sure that our audience learned a lot, and their contact information is in the chat if you're watching live, if you have follow-up questions, or you can Google them. That computer system will probably, maybe in the fourth or fifth result, give you an accurate link to find each of them. Thank you both. Reminder that we will be doing our next event on March 31st at 12:15, Myths and Facts about contesting the 2026 midterm elections. Have a good day. Thank you. Bye-bye.